And John, it is all yours.
Okay. So I am John Porter, and I am the Urban Agriculture Program Coordinator, which is a joint position between Extension and Nebraska College of Technical Agriculture. And NCTA is nowhere near Omaha. It's out in Curtis. It's about a 4.5 hour trip out to campus from Omaha for me. But I only go there every once in a while for meetings. So what my job is, of course, I do extension programs related to urban agriculture and vegetable production and local foods in and around the Omaha area. And am currently exploring the ideas of developing some sort of formal education program in urban agriculture, whether that would be credit courses, certificates, or an associate's degree. I started this job about a year ago, just over a year ago, and I had previously worked in my native state of West Virginia with Extension. I was the county agriculture agent in Kanawha County, which is Charleston, where the state capital is, and had been with Extension there for 8 years. And before that, did a master's degree in horticulture from WVU and an undergrad in botany from Marshall University. And most people don't know where Marshall is, but they might have seen it in a movie about a plane crash that killed the football team back in the 70s. That was the school I went to. But we're here to talk about vegetable gardening. So I'm going to go through some slides that I have. We're going to sort of split it into parts. We have a break about halfway through. So I'll go about halfway through. We'll take a break. And then when we come back, we have an activity that you can do. You can take a little while to do it there on site. And then we will pick back up and get through as much as we can before time runs out. Feel free if you have questions from your sites to put them in the chat. And if I don't see them, Terry can see them and let me know what's going on. So I sort of like to think about vegetable gardening if we're planning a vegetable garden, to sort of have a plan in place, and thinking about when I started to put together everything, I could start with the letter S. So it's I call it the 5S garden planning list, starting with the site selection, and then soil and fertility, plant selection, scheduling, and then knowing where to find a good source of information, and having that handy. So that will be part of the sort of planning part that I talk about when we first begin. So whenever you're first picking a site, you look at and see what's available. If it's at home, maybe if you're doing a project, maybe you're doing a master gardener project and you're looking to site a new demonstration garden or community garden, these would all be useful for those things. So you want to make sure that it fits the space. You don't want to have sort of high ideals and maybe be a little too ambitious on what you can actually fit in the space. And thinking about your production, you might be able to cram a lot of stuff in there, but you have to make sure that you leave enough space to be able to move around, to be mobile, but also to not space things too closely, because you might have some plant health issues. You need to make sure it's accessible. You need to make sure that you can easily get to it, even if it's in your own yard. There's a lot of studies that show, for anything that the more accessible and easier to get to it is, the more likely you're able to use it. So if you have a big yard, if you're out in a rural area, don't put your garden, a mile away. Put it close to where you'll use it. You need to figure out the needs that you're trying to meet. So are you just growing stuff for fresh consumption? Are you wanting to grow stuff for later use to can or preserve? Are you growing it in a community garden? Are you growing it to give away? Are you growing stuff to sell? So you need to think about that, and how big is the site, and is the site big enough to meet those needs? You have to think about the light for crops. Does it have enough light for what you're wanting to grow? And most stuff that we're going to grow is going to need quite a bit of sunlight, at least 6 hours or more. But there are things, if you have less sunlight, that you can grow. So we'll sort of talk about those. And then has access to water. So that might not be an issue at home. You usually have some sort of water source, like a water faucet or something outside that you can put a water hose to. If not, then there might be an issue you having to take water by the can full or bucket full outside. And this is a consideration when you're looking, say, for a community garden site or a demonstration garden site, having water available, and that's a definite issue. If you don't have water, then you're going to have issues with plant health and having a productive garden. So I saw sort of a few things that I've seen about light. So they're general rules of thumb, but it's not a one size fits all. But if you grow it for the fruit or the root, you'll need full sun at least 6 to 8 hours a day. And in general, if it's a leafy crop or something you're growing for the stem, you can do partial shade, maybe about 4 hours of sunlight. There aren't any crops that won't survive without sunlight. You'll need, at least some light for stuff. And I saw this list. We can find all kinds of information online, whether or not it's true or not. Unfortunately, when I popped it up here, I had some shifting going on because some of these things can be a little shade tolerant. They can grow in about 4 hours of sunlight. And even though it says shade tolerant, some of them will definitely do better if they're have a little more light. So my little X'd out signs moved a little bit there. So it's usually the root crops. They need a little bit more. But the leafy crops on there, they tend to be perfectly fine with about 4 hours of light. The others will grow, they just won't be as productive. So when we're thinking about our site, we also want to think about our design, our structure, our growing system, and how we're going to build that and what we need. So some people, especially if they have larger gardens, they might just till up a spot and have an in-ground garden with the traditional rows. You might do beds or raised beds, or if you have a small space, containers. And there are pros and cons and trade-offs to all these different things. So if you're growing in ground or in rows, there's less infrastructure. You don't need to build beds, no raised beds, but it can lead to a larger space to maintain, especially if you have sort of the large traditional in-row gardens. You have more space between the rows, and that's more space to maintain with both weeds or to have inputs with fertility, with mulching, things like that. But it is good for larger crops. Some things are just too big to put in smaller beds. They just are space hogs. So it's kind of hard in raised beds to grow things like squash, pumpkins, some of the bigger crops. So those might be better outside of a bed system. Now, when I say beds or raised beds, so raised beds is what most people are used to, but you don't have to raise them. Just using a space like a 4x8 space or larger, then you can actually just grow them in the ground. Just have a space like a walkway between them that you could either have mulched or have like a low ground cover growing on, whether it's grass or clover or something like that. So the nice thing about beds is it's easier access. If you have beds and you don't have a large garden that you have to walk through, then if it's rainy, you can garden even when the soil is damp. You can do a raised bed and you don't have to bend as far, so it makes it easier if you get it up off the ground. And you can use intensive spacing in beds, so you can get stuff a little closer together. That way you can have a few benefits, and we'll talk about those later. And then containers. So if you don't have a large area, if you don't have a large garden, if you're in an apartment or a townhouse, something like that, using that container can be small space. It's usually limited to smaller crops. You're not going to be growing big stuff in containers, but definitely some of the leafy greens, stuff that doesn't have a lot of root structure, those can be grown in containers. So if we go to talking about after we've selected our site, getting our soil ready, the first thing that we always recommend is to test soil and to test it regularly. So you want to do a good soil test to look at the fertility, and you want to amend that as indicated by the soil test. And with vegetable gardens, it's a little bit different. So with landscapes, with perennials, typically, you can plant those and it doesn't require as much soil testing and amending, because with the vegetable garden, you are annually harvesting and removing nutrients from the garden. So when you harvest a tomato or lettuce, you're taking nutrients that came from the soil, and you need to replace those. And that's not as needed, say, if you are growing perennials and the only thing that you remove is the debris at the end of the season. But you just want to add what is recommended by the soil test. There's been sort of this long tradition of people just throwing some sort of fertilizer, even organic nutrient sources on the garden without testing. And we really frown on that because, number one, those are things that you've invested in. You've had to buy them or you've had to create them. You've had to compost. So sometimes you're just throwing your money or your effort away. Or if you really get the nutrients too high in there, you can damage plants. There is such a thing as too much fertility. And you could also be a source for pollution. If there's runoff, you could be putting those nutrients in the water and having them run off. So organic matter is good. Not only does it put some nutrients in there, but it helps with texture, and it also helps to feed the microbiology. It feeds fungi and bacteria that give us good quality soil. But if you are just needing to amend the fertility, and you need, if you need a lot of fertility, or if using an amendment, an organic amendment might not work for you, then using a commercial fertilizer is okay. You just want to balance it. You do want to have some organic matter in there, but using a little commercial fertilizer is okay. The plants actually can't tell the difference. The plant doesn't know if the fertilizer, if the nutrition came out of a bag or if it came out of compost. Where the difference is with the soil health. So using it is fine, just keeping in mind that organic is also needed in the soil. And so there are things that plants need out of the soil. So there are a number of micro and macronutrients that plants need to grow. And so those are very important in vegetable gardening because we have those high needs because we are removing nutrients from the soil. And sometimes we can have plenty of them in the soil, but they're just not available to the plants. And that's where pH comes in. So pH sort of controls how well those nutrients are bonded to the soil structure. And so at different pHs, they might be released at different levels. And this has been an adjustment for me because I came from West Virginia, where the soil is much different and the pH level is much different. So in West Virginia, it's actually a clay-based acidic soil. So where here in Nebraska, things are a little alkaline, that could be up to even 8 or 8.5. If you were to go to a soil in West Virginia that hadn't been amended and do a soil test, the pH would come back probably around 5.5. So for Anything but an acid-loving plant, you would have to amend it with lime to get the pH up. You don't really have to do that here, but the only place where you might run into trouble is if you're trying to grow some of those acidic things. So root crops especially prefer to be, they don't need to be acidic, but they don't really like a high pH. So if you're having trouble growing potatoes or carrots or something like that, you might need to look at the pH on that and check it out. And it definitely has an effect. It's not in the vegetable world, but in fruits like blueberries and some of those flowers like azaleas and rhododendrons. They don't grow well here because of this. They are high iron feeders, and so they need an acidic soil around a pH of 4.5 up to 5, and we just can't get the soils down that low. So that's why pH plays a role in there. And then one of the things that we've really been trying to educate people on is the use of tillage. If you have an in-ground garden, the traditional method was sort of based on row crop farming technique where you would till up the soil every year, maybe multiple times, and then you would form your rows and grow in rows or grow in beds. And we're really trying to encourage people to reduce tillage or not till at all. And it really has to do with the soil health. So soil structure is important for promoting those good microbiology players. So the fungi and the bacteria, they actually like when we have those little concretions of soil. A lot of people think, well, if I till up the soil and make it a nice fine powder, that's a good soil structure, and it's actually not. So we disturb those layers of soil. We want the organic layer up top and then the topsoil down below. If we till it, we sort of upset that. If we till, we can increase our water runoff. We sort of increase microbial activity to such a level that it eats up all that organic matter and releases it in the form of carbon dioxide and methane. And we have soil compaction. And what happens there is if you're doing a tiller or something through the garden, at the bottom of where those tines are tilling up the soil, it actually compacts the soil and creates what we call a hard pan. So then water and air will not percolate through there. And so you can create soil compaction that creates an issue for the soil. So try to reduce your tillage if you are tilling. And you might say, well, how do I work my organic matter in there? Well, I say, once you get your garden started, just putting that organic matter on the top, it will actually work itself down if you have the water percolating down through it. And it will eventually get there itself. So try to reduce your tillage if at all possible. Now, one of the issues that we might see if you're in an urban area, whether or not it's a big city or a small town, we have an urban soil issue where we could potentially have contamination, and it's something that we definitely have to look at. So looking at the previous use, did it have some sort of industrial use? Was it a waste site? Was it a commercial use that could have produced some sort of chemical that would have leached into the soil? Or some things that we might not think about, and this could be anywhere. If you're siting a garden, say near a house, so there was a point where paint had lead in it, and so that was a big issue with lead from the paint. So if you had a lead painted house and the paint peeled off and got in the soil, there could be lead in the soil. We used lead pipes a lot for plumbing. And if it was in an area in a heavily traffic congested area or near a roadway where vehicles were idling, then there could have been the issue of pollution from exhaust from leaded gasoline before gas became unleaded. So if you think you have one of those issues, what you want to do is you can, when you're doing your fertility test, the soil testing labs will also test for contaminants. So you can do those. They will cost a little bit more, but it could be worth it if you want that peace of mind on there. So we have, all of those different things and things you might not have thought about, like, was there a dry cleaner there, gas stations, petroleum spills, pesticide use. So things you might want to think about and have that tested. And in some places, like in Omaha, there was actually a brownfield site from industrial waste. So due to that, there was a federal grant to actually do cleanup on that. So in Omaha, and I don't know if there's anywhere else in Nebraska like this, but you can actually go onto an online map where they actually have tested the soil, and you can look up your lot, and it will say whether or not you had lead contamination found in your soil, and if there was it remediated? And so I looked up my house site, and I did have lead contamination, and it was remediated. So what they did was they actually completely scraped the house and repainted it, and they actually removed all of the soil, the topsoil from the lot, and replaced it. So there could be that kind of stuff going on. So you'll just have to check in your area, and you can find some more resources about that. So check with the health department. There's also, if you look in the notes from this presentation, there's an EPA guide on growing gardens in urban soils that contains information on contaminants. You have to realize that the major risk is from the soil residue on the plants, that they don't necessarily really take these things up, especially on the heavy metals from lead. So it's not like, if you grow tomatoes, unless those tomatoes are in contact with the ground, there's a minimal risk to that. If you are growing a root crop or say a leafy green that's in direct contact with the soil, then there is that issue. You would have to make sure it's washed well, or you can take steps, make sure you do stuff like raised beds or use containers in areas that are contaminated, using mulches to keep soil from splashing up on things. So there are ways to get around it. So when we select plants, we want to talk about plants that fit our needs. People probably gasp when they hear this, but I am not a fan of raw tomatoes. Just never developed the taste for them. I will eat them cooked anyway, but I don't grow a lot of slicing tomatoes that would just be eaten raw, but I do grow tomatoes. I grow Roma tomatoes and use them for canning. Or cooking type tomatoes that I would use in different recipes. Sometimes some cherry tomatoes, because those are interesting. You can actually dehydrate those and use them in recipes, and use them actually as raisins on salad, which is another story. We should also plant plants that can grow in the area we're looking at. Like I said earlier, maybe we're not going to grow those acid-loving plants here, like blueberries. I had my heart set on blueberries. But I'm not going to do that anymore. So make sure it is in the right zone and that it grows in the soil conditions and the light conditions that you have. We look at disease resistance. So some of the newer cultivars and hybrids have a lot of disease resistance bred into them. Some of the heirlooms, maybe not so much. And if you're having disease issues, one of the easier ways to control that is to actually plant things that can't get that disease. And if you are not sure, there's all kinds of extension growing guides out there from Nebraska and from other states. So check those out. So when we're selecting plants, I do get a lot of questions about what about hybrid? What about heirloom? What about genetically engineered or GMO or open pollinated? What do those things mean? So I thought I would just touch on the definition of those things so that you know what the seed packet means, or whatever the catalog means when it says these things. So I'm going to start with open pollinated. These things are things that will breed true when they self-pollinate or are pollinated by another plant of the same variety. So, if I have a tomato and I can save the seeds from it, and it's going to be that same tomato next year, then it's an open pollinated variety. So they're really easy to save seeds from. That definition goes a step further. If it has some sort of history, if it was passed down within a family or community, or if it's been available for 50 years or more, it's considered an heirloom. So an heirloom has to have a history, has to be at least 50 years old, and it has to be open pollinated so that you can save the seeds from it. The next, heirloom pros and heirloom cons. Pros, it has interesting, exciting varieties. We can have interesting histories. It's whether it's a personal history, something that your family has saved, or it's the history of your state, your region, your area. They can be adapted regionally. So if you plant it and save the seeds from it, then over the next few years, as you save seeds from it, you're going to save them from the plants that do well in your garden, and it's going to actually adapt that to your conditions. There are some cons, however. They often lack disease and pest resistance because those haven't been bred in. So you could get lots of more disease issues with those plants. They may not grow well in different regions. Most of them come from a specific area. A lot of plants, beans and tomatoes have come from sort of the east, from the Appalachian region where I'm from. So they may not grow as well here. So you have to be aware of that. And sometimes they can be a little unpredictable, or they may have low yield. And when we talk about hybrids, we'll talk about why they may have lower yields than, say, a hybrid. So with a hybrid, it's a controlled method of pollination where someone takes plant 1 and plant 2 and crosses it. So it can be natural and random. So these plants are just out in nature and they cross themselves and someone finds it. Or it's someone that has had a breeding program where they have painstakingly crossed plants, and it can take a long time. So fruits and vegetables. So vegetables, that are annual in nature, it could take maybe 10 to 20 years to produce a new hybrid because you have to cross them. Then you grow those offspring out, and then you see what you like and keep crossing them to get the traits that you want. Some of the fruits and trees and things that take a lot longer, those could take 30 to 50 years to develop with a hybrid method. There are some misconceptions about hybrids. They are not genetically engineered. They're not created in that way. And technically you can save the seeds from it, but what happens is you get a mix of different traits from the mother and the father plants from that, instead of what you would expect. So if you save a tomato that you like, you're going to get a few that are like that next year, and then you're going to get a few that are more like the mother plant and a few that are more like the father plant. But you can keep saving those seeds from the ones that you like, and after a few years, you'll sort of have developed your own open pollinated variety from that. But it's not going to be exactly what it was. Like a celebrity tomato, you're not going to be able to save the seeds and get exactly that type of tomato. So the pros, a lot of these have been bred to increase disease and pest resistance. A lot of those issues that are very common, if they can breed them in, they try to do that. There's also something called hybrid vigor, and it's just some sort of genetic anomaly where if you have the genes from 2 different individuals in that plant, from the generation before, it actually has higher production than, say, something that has the same genes generation after generation. So they usually are more productive than heirlooms. And usually they've been developed to be successful in many different regions. So you will usually have more uniform success in different areas. Of course, they may be a little less interesting than the heirlooms. You get, like, if you think about heirloom tomatoes versus the hybrid tomatoes, most of the hybrid tomatoes are those perfect round red tomatoes. They may have good flavor, but they're not as exciting as all those heirlooms that have the weird shapes and colors and sizes. They may not grow well in different regions, and there's inconsistency with saved seed. Like I said before, you're not going to get exactly what you had if you saved the seeds. But there's typically not an issue with saving the seeds. It is possible to do that in most cases. So where we get a lot of confusion and contention is with GMOs, or genetically engineered crops. So this method is used if something is needed to be introduced very quickly into the genetic pool. So there are lots of different things that are engineered into plants, and we actually like the term genetically engineered better than GMO, because there's confusion. People say, well, of course everything is genetically modified, because if it's hybridized or crossbred, then of course it's modified from the generation before, so it's not a very precise term. So the one that most people are usually aware of and usually have an issue with is whenever crops have been genetically engineered to be, say, resistant to certain pesticides or herbicides. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. There's been lots of different things done that have had really high impact all around the world. So golden rice has been developed with beta carotene in it to help control or stop blindness in third world countries where nutrition is bad. In Southeast Asia, eggplant is a huge crop, and there's lots of insect pests. If you've ever grown eggplant, you know that there are flea beetles that get on it. There are different worms and weevils that will get in it and destroy the fruit. And so traditionally in those areas, they've used lots and lots of pesticides, and without using the proper equipment. So I've seen videos of people just walking through a field with a backpack sprayer, no protection, in a cloud of pesticide, which was causing a lot of health issues. But some universities got together and actually genetically engineered an eggplant crop that has the BT gene in it, which helps kill some of those insects. And in farms that use that, not only are they not spending money on that pesticide, but their health is much better because they're not using it. So it's basically really turned around some of those communities, and the list goes on and on. So there are positives and there are negatives to that technology. However, some things that you actually should think about. There are pros, lots of issues that have been fixed. One thing that they're looking at now is bananas. So all the bananas that you buy at the store are the same variety of banana, and there's a disease that's starting to wipe them out. So it could be potential in the next decade or so that we do not have bananas. So that's a rapid issue, and they need to figure out how to control that. And it's really hard to control with a pesticide, especially with people wanting more organic. So there are still fears and concerns, even though there have been lots of scientific research saying that they are safe and effective. That's basically probably 95% of science and scientists that have studied that see that. And there are other issues, but it's good to know this for your own self, that it doesn't matter in vegetable gardening because you can't buy them anyway. There are no genetically engineered crops available to home gardeners. You can't go to the seeds shelf, a seed rack, or a catalog and buy them if you're a home gardener. There are no varieties available that you would purchase. Usually they're not those crops that you would grow in a home garden anyway. There are no GMO radishes or lettuces or anything like that. Usually it's reserved for the commodity crops. So corn, soy, cotton, canola are the big ones, and a lot of those you aren't going to grow. And if you are concerned, like if you're growing corn or if you're growing soy, you would not be able to just go and buy them. You actually have to sign an agreement that you will plant them responsibly, that you're not going to save the seeds. So unless someone hands you a contract to sign, then you will know that you have not been able to purchase those. And like I said, there has been concern with hybrids being genetically engineered. That's sort of been a myth going around, and it is not the case. So the activity that we're going to do a little bit later is around scheduling, and that is something that I think a lot of gardeners don't think about. They run out, the first opportunity after the last frost, they plant everything. They, sort of tend it until it dies a slow, painful death, and then they're done gardening for the year. But actually, if you think about it and if you plan ahead, you can have multiple harvests, multiple crops in the same space each year. And that can really increase your productivity, especially if you are gardening in a small area. You can make the most use of that space. So you want to start your seeds at the appropriate time for your area. So having a plan ahead will let you know that, hey, yes, I can start these at this time of year and they will be ready for me. And you don't have to rush out the plant, like I said. So things like tomatoes, people go out and plant them right after the last frost, and you can actually plant tomatoes well up into the season, even as late as June or July, and still get a crop before fall. And you can think, well, yeah, I have tomatoes, and the first ones that I plant, sort of by the mid-season, they are, sort of showing their wear. They have a few diseases. They're starting to slow down on productivity. So what if I have a plan to actually replace those, to have tomatoes that will start producing in the second half of the season? Then I can rip those tomatoes that aren't doing so well out and replace them with something for the fall. So we can really increase our productivity if we think about things in that manner. And we can also plan for, when we do our plan, we actually look at basically the soil temp. So you usually start planting when it's around 45 degrees for those warm season crops. Other stuff you can do earlier. But having that plan will let you sort of be ready when those things are ready to be planted. So if we have some different techniques that we can think about whenever we're scheduling that. So succession planting, we can sort of schedule multiple harvests throughout the season, and it makes good use of that space. And so there are some different types that we think about. So true succession planting would be when we come up with a plan where we're planting a crop in the spring that's one of those cool season crops. Then when it's done, say, early or late spring, early summer, when it starts to warm up, we can plant our warm season crop in there. We may or may not have to remove it. So if it's not something that's a big crop that will crowd out, let's say I have some lettuce that I planted in the spring, and then when May rolls around and I want to plant my tomatoes, if the lettuce isn't too thick and it's still going okay, I could leave the lettuce in place and make room and plant a tomato and let that start growing while I finish off the lettuce. And then, at the end of the season, when the tomato maybe starts to wind down, I can think about replacing it or planting something in that area that will go for the fall. So another one of those cool season crops. We can also do relay planting, which is maybe I'm using things for fresh eating, and so I don't need to plant 100 carrots all at once. Maybe I go out and I plant 10 carrots in intervals of, say, 2 weeks. So this week I go and I sow 10 carrot seeds, and then the next week I go out, or 2 weeks from now I go out and I sow 10 or 20 more. And so I can actually relay those, and that will be using different space. So it wouldn't be like you're going to be able to remove those and replant them. So you'll have to have some space ready for those relays. And then we have maturity planting. So that is planting different cultivars at the same time that mature at different times. So if I'm planting, say, 10 tomato plants and I don't need all of them to mature at once, then I will maybe select a variety that matures in 80 days, and those will mature at that time. And then I select some that maybe mature in 100 days. And so then I've planted them at the same time, but the crops develop at a different time. So then I'm not harvesting all of those tomatoes at the same time. And we have to think about, are we going to use, how are we going to use them? If it's fresh eating, you want to have those scheduled throughout the season. Maybe if you're a preserver or a canner and you want a larger quantity, then you schedule one of those plantings to be a larger quantity that you will then harvest and preserve. And you can be a little bit in control there, because I can tell you, having gone out and just planted everything at once, that there were times where maybe I was 10 batches into whatever I was canning at midnight and really wanted to be done with it, but still had more to go. So you can schedule that a little bit easier. So if we think about things in sort of early season that are the cool crops, we have long season crops that are more of the warm season crops, and then we have some of the cool crops or the fast growing warm season crops that are more of, you can plant them in the fall. So in early season crops, if we think about it, we have cooler soils. So these are things that will germinate or grow well whenever the soil is cool. So we have beets and cabbage and some leafy greens and spinach, lettuce. So those things grow really well in the spring. Then we have those warm season crops, the beans and tomatoes and corn and eggplant, potatoes. So we can maybe plant those, in the early spring, but they will thrive best whenever it's hot out in the garden. And then we could come back later in the season and we have bush beans that mature really quickly. So maybe you do a fall planting in July or something of those. Or the cool season crops, you can plant those and have them grow and be ready for the winter. So some of those things like broccoli and cauliflower, they are cool season crops, but they maybe start best whenever it's warmer. So getting them started and then getting them grown. And then if you're using some sort of season protection, you can, if you get these things grown up before it really gets cold and starts freezing, and you use some sort of protection on them, you can maybe, they're not going to grow really all that much during that time, but you'll be able to sort of store them in place if you cover them up and keep them a little bit longer in the garden. And then one of the things that we should think about whenever we are doing when scheduling is think about crop rotation. This is good, what we call integrated pest management. And it's also good to make different use of the soil. So if we rotate by family, usually we have the same diseases and insects that affect the family. So, a lot of the diseases that affect potatoes also affect tomatoes, and all around the different families. So if I have this area in my garden where I've planted tomatoes, then I don't want to plant anything in that same family there for maybe, a good rotation is at least 4 years. Maybe you don't have room for that. And maybe you don't have room to rotate at all, but this is one of the best practices that we recommend. So thinking about rotating that around, or also thinking about rotating it by crop structure, and that thinks about the soil building and also the nutrient needs of the plant. So if you're growing a root crop one year, maybe you want to grow something the next year that's not a root crop, that's a leafy crop, and then the next year something that's a fruit crop, because they all use different nutrients in different ways. And think about those nutrient needs. So the legumes like beans and peas actually add nitrogen into the soil. So maybe the year after you plant those, you want to use something that needs that extra nitrogen. So if you're planting corn, then that needs extra nitrogen because it's a heavy nitrogen feeder. So planting that after the beans And that's where, we get our sort of row crop rotation in there between the soybeans and the corn. But if you're not growing corn, the one thing that I rotate after my beans is garlic, because garlic is also a heavy nitrogen feeder. And the way the cropping works, you plant garlic in the fall in October, so that's after maybe you ripped out those beans, and then you harvest it in summer, so then you can plant another fall crop after you've removed the garlic from that area. So thinking about those different rotations, if you've learned your plant families, if you know your plant families and what's in them, thinking about that can really increase your likelihood of success. So, like I said, it has benefits for the microbes. It what we would say prevents exhausting the soil, and it also can help weed control if we use different things. If I have a crop on there that more covers the soil, then that will suppress weeds, or being able to compete with those weeds in different ways. So if we look at sources of information, you want to seek trustworthy sources of gardening info. So extension is always a good place to start, and universities is a good place to start. But I will tell you that there are, unfortunately, maybe systems that don't have such a rigorous, maybe peer review process when they're producing new, fact sheets, or what we call NEB guides. If people aren't looking at some of those things that aren't really all that science-based, slip in. So you definitely want to look at that. A lot of people these days get their information from social media, and that's a good place to pick up myths and fake info. And there's lots and lots of fake gardening info out there. Lots of those things like, those homemade remedies like, the vinegar for weed control and the Epsom salts for plant growth. Those aren't really substantiated by science. So you want to definitely investigate those dubious claims. And if you're not sure, ask someone who knows, and they can maybe help you think about those things. So just some trusted sources of information that I can share is looking at the Extension Master Gardener resources. So there are national resources, and those are available to everyone. So there's a Facebook page for the Extension Master Gardener National Program, and there's Twitter at NE-EMG, and a Pinterest page. And actually, we can definitely vouch for that information because Terry is actually the leader of that group, and I am one of the administrators and contributors to the content there. So that's definitely a great source of information. Another place, if you're really interested in science-based information and if you have questions, is called the Garden Professors. I am one of the garden professors, and we have a page where we put articles where we've written. So there's a Facebook page and a web page where those go up, the sort of a blog. And then there's a group where you can sort of ask questions or see questions asked, and everything is evidence-based. So if there's not some sort of research that's been published in a journal that can back up a claim, then people will sort of pick it apart. But you do want to, if you are a member there or if you join there, you definitely want to make sure that you keep with that evidence-based information, or you will get called out for sharing anecdotal or misleading information. So those are some definite sources that you can look at. So I'm going to so that's sort of the garden planning part. We have maybe about 12 minutes.
We have some questions, John.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say we could do some questions before we take our break.
Do you want me to read them to you, or can you see them?
I can actually see them. So I'm going to start with the home septic system. That's a good question, and I don't know all the information right offhand, but that is, definitely. So not only do we have the the food safety issue of the human pathogens that could be in there, but we also have that can be a sort of concentrated source of any of those. If we've been consuming things that maybe like chemicals or something that could be built up in there. So I know for things like if there's a garden that's flooded and the water could have potentially had that type of contaminant in there, that the waiting period is at least 6 months or more. But if it's concentrated in a home septic system, I'd really have to look that up, and definitely you would want to have that tested. But if that is definitely a question that someone needs an answer to, we can look that up and get them that information. Where does organic seed fit in? So that's a good question. So I actually have, if you go to the Garden Professor's page there that I have shared, the website, I put up an article about the words that you find on a seed packet, and organic is one of them. So organic means that the seed has been produced from plants that have been grown organically. There are different levels of organic. So most people, if they say organic, they mean certified organic, which means that it has had some sort of certification process. So USDA certified organic is the most stringent. That comes from the federal government, from the USDA. You can also have certification from third parties like nonprofit organizations, or from states like the State Department of Agriculture. They can do certifications in some cases. So what that means is the plants that it were grown on were grown organically, and organic does not mean that it did not have pesticide applied. There are organic pesticides. So organic in any case does not mean pesticide free. But if a pesticide was used, it was organic. So it was either from a natural plant or bacteria source, or from a naturally occurring element in that would be harvested from the ground. I often tell people that if you are buying seed just based on the potential for, say, contamination by a pesticide, like you are buying organic seed just because you are afraid of any pesticide residue on there, that the likelihood that a non-organic seed has residue on it is pretty low, because they're not going to be sprayed directly on the seed. The plant really doesn't uptake that and spread that through the plant. So if that's your only concern, I typically for myself don't see if the organic seed costs more than the conventional, then I don't spring for the organic, because there's not that much of a difference in actual potential for having a pesticide on it. You also have to think that even if it did have pesticide on it, that the amount would be so small that once the plant grew, that you wouldn't even be able to detect it. If you are buying organic instead because you want to support organic farming practices, then buying that organic seed will support that organic system, just knowing that it's not going to grow any better or worse than the non-organic version of the plant. You sort of just have to make that decision on your own. The only place where it's really required is if you are growing organic or certified organic for sell. If you are selling the produce, then you would have to use organic seed. But there is an exception that if there's not a readily available source of organic seed, that you can get an exception and use conventional seed. How far do crops need to be when you rotate? It's better if you can get them, at least some distance away, especially for like diseases that are splashed by what we call wind splashed rain, where we're splashing soil up from the ground onto the plants. So if it's just a foot from where it was last year, then it's not going to do a lot of good in that sense. But even if it is close, like the activity we're going to do when we come back is actually, I want you to imagine you have one 4x8 raised bed, and you're going to create a rotation plan for that. So even some rotation, if it's within a few feet, will have some benefit. So no-till versus forking, ever been compared? I think there are those comparisons out there. They're not coming to me right offhand, but the soil, unless it is compacted, there isn't a huge benefit to disturbing the soil. So it might make it easier to work for you if you are needing to plant. But I would have to look up, because I don't really know that there's an advantage for forking over no-till. But that's a good question. So with no-till gardening, how do you deal with all the insects that overwinter or lay eggs in the soil around the plant during the winter? So some of that's taken care of with your crop rotation, and also using mulch can help with that. And you also want to remove the debris. A lot of those things aren't necessarily coming from the soil itself. It's from some sort of debris, especially when we're talking about diseases. So being clean in the garden and cleaning up that debris can really help. Mulching can really help, and crop rotation can really help. Do we have any more questions before
I
we
have
go?
a couple that came in through Slido.
Okay.
One of them is, how do you prepare a new or virgin garden spot if tilling is discouraged?
I always tell people that if you're preparing a new garden, if you must till, that is fine. But you can also sort of start off, instead of planting in the ground, to actually put a heavy layer of organic matter on top, starting with some compost, or some compost and topsoil mixed that's sort of on top. If you're doing beds and raised beds, it's not an issue because you're building the soil from scratch. But also, just working the top of the soil maybe, so you can just get stuff planted. You don't have to till in deep. Then using mulch. So if you have time, let's say I'm wanting to build a new garden and I'm doing beds and I'm thinking ahead and I'm going to be doing it next year, then doing a heavy layer of wood chip mulch, say, up to a foot, and then letting that break down over, the year or so, can sort of build that soil that will be the top. And smother out those weeds and things, and it will be easier to plant in if you start on the top of the soil.
So the next one is, what is the best soil mixture for microgreens?
Oh, so we're getting into microgreens. That is a good question. So when I tell people, if you're growing microgreens, that basically think of it as seed starting. But instead of growing the plant to maturity, you're just starting it up to a small seedling size to consume it. So really, you want something that you would use for seed starting, which what is ideal is the sort of the soil as seed starting mix that is low in fertility and sterile in terms of microorganisms. Because the biggest enemy to those small plants are things like damping off, which will kill them. But also, if you're using something that may have soil or an organic matter like compost in it, you can have the potential for human pathogens coming from those. So using that seed starting mix, and you can maybe reuse it a few times, and then put it in the compost or whatever. That's probably the best thing to use.
So the next question is, can you use railroad ties for raised beds?
So we'll sort of be getting into raised beds in the second half. But railroad ties is one of those things that we discourage because of the leaching of the creosote from them. They are treated with creosote, and that treatment is both a preservative for them and also meant to kill any weeds or anything that would grow around them. So it's pretty harsh to plants. So not only do you have the issue of the chemical leaching into the soil, but it can also damage plants, roots, or plants that touch it. So I always encourage people to steer away from railroad ties.
The last question on the Slidos is, can you please tell us what the plant families are and which plants are included in each?
Okay, so I usually try to include a list in there, but I did not this time for some reason. But so the plant families, like the legumes, the beans and peas, those are in there. The tomato family is tomatoes and potatoes and peppers and eggplant. Those are the solanaceous crops, the tomato family. Um, we have lettuce is actually in the sunflower family and the daisy family, and some of those other greens like chicory are in there. Then we have the alliums, which are the onions and the garlic and the chives, things like that. Most of the other herbs, a lot of the herbs like basil and rosemary are in the mint family. We have herbs that are also in the carrot family. So the carrot family is carrots and parsnips and dill and fennel, things like that. And let's see, other crops. So we have sort of the spinach family, which is spinach and beets and Swiss chard. And then we have
Brassicaceae.
the brassicas. So we've got all of the cabbage and the broccoli and cauliflower, and also the other greens like mustard and kale and radishes and things like that in that family.
That was very good. All right. Well, it's 7:30.
So we have one more in the chat. I will hit that when we come back.
Okay. I have the second question up if you guys want to answer that one real quick. I'll leave that one up for a couple more minutes, and then I will move to the third question for the Slido. We're going to give John a break for his voice for the next 15 minutes, and we will see you all back at 7:45. So how was everybody's break? I don't know. It looks like John answered a couple of the questions in the chat box while you're on break. I did have a question with the campus master gardeners about where to go get soil tests. Usually here, it's either Ward Lab in Kearney or Midwest Labs in Omaha. Those are two that I know of off the top of my head. So those would be a couple options for you. Do you want to go through those quick questions? And then we'll
yeah, I can. So the one about the ideal mulch for a vegetable garden. So there really isn't an ideal one, but we will talk about if we get to it. I have a list of mulches that are good for vegetable gardens. And if not, I will be sure to mention that at the end. Just remind me if we don't get to that. And then Elizabeth submitted a question about the best way to grow Brussels sprouts. Those are a tough one because they take quite a bit of time. You know, you have to get the stalk growing up, and then they sit on the stalk. So, they're basically like advanced cabbage. Some of the issues you run into are like the pest problems. Lots of the cabbage worms eating those. So if you can wrap them up with like a a row cover, just, and not even like put it over the plant, but like wrap it around the plant after it's gotten up mature size. Or using, some sort of insect control on that. That would be ideal, but you growing them, I think they probably do better if, those things like the cole crops, the cabbage, Brussels sprouts do really good if you get them out really early. We're talking before even the last frost. Those things can tolerate cold temperatures and frost. They can't do a heavy freeze, but getting them out early will help, or putting them out in late summer for a fall crop, because they will keep producing up until they sort of run out of time at the end of the year. And you had a question, Terry.
It was just the soil, where to get a soil test.
Oh, okay, that was it. Okay.
So I did have one of my master gardeners who's doing Slido say that the last question, number 3, I needed to make it multiple choice and multiple answer. So I have updated that. So if you guys want to go back in and do that, that would be great. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, John.
Okay, so we decided that since you folks like doing sort of a hands-on activity, it's kind of hard to go out and maybe have you plant a vegetable garden this time of year, but doing some sort of planning activity, I think, is good. So I'm going to give you maybe about 10 minutes to do this. Here we wanted to do it right after break so we would not run out of time to do it. Also, it gives me a little bit of a longer break. I mean, I'll be here for questions, but I don't have to talk at you for 10 more minutes. So basically, you should have a handout. And I want you to imagine that you are either coming up with a plan for yourself, or you're doing a plan to demonstrate crop rotation and succession planting. There are 2 techniques that we haven't gotten to yet, but I sort of mentioned like where we can put the tomatoes with the lettuce and use the same space. That's intercropping. And then intensive plant spacing, I did give you a guide. So if you've ever heard of something, say like square foot gardening or something like that, that's that. And there should be a chart there with you with some of those spacings that you can use, even if we don't get to talk about them. So I've given you a sheet or 2 sheets. Each sheet has a raised bed plan of 4 by 8. So there are 4 squares by 8 squares. And I want you to think about an 8-year or a 4-year rotation on those. So the first year is going to be easy. So in year 1, I want you need to include at least 3 crops. You can include as many as you want, but remember, the more you put, the harder the rotation gets. So I want a root crop, a fruit crop, and a leaf crop in the bed every year. And you can break up the bed however you want. You can do individual squares as individual crops, or you can section it off into thirds or fourths and do it that way, whatever you want to do. Each year must include some sort of succession planting or intercropping, but the whole bed doesn't have to include that. So the only thing that I'm really looking for mainly is the scheduling of putting in some sort of succession planting or crop rotation, or at least a crop rotation. So I want a different crop from a different family. And if you can't remember the families, feel free to look them up or ask, and I can help you with those again. So doing a crop rotation at least, and some sort of succession planting if you can. You don't have to grow the same crops every year. Use the chart as a guideline, and all areas of the bed must be planted at least once during the year. So here's that sort of intensive spacing that I told you. This is sort of based on square foot gardening. You can get a lot more in than you think, like 9 bush beans per square foot. This also sort of gives you a guide of when it grows. If it's summer, it's one of those warm or long season crops. If it's spring or fall, it's one of those cool season crops. Remember that some plants take more than 1 square foot. So a tomato takes much larger, but you can plant stuff around the tomato. So think about that. So I'll show you. So here, we have the bed. So let's say I have year 1, and so I'm going to section off in say I'll do quarters. So, and maybe I won't do them all the same direction. So I'll do oh, well, let me find my eraser here. I'm going everywhere. Oh, well, that doesn't move. Okay. So I want to section that off like that. So that's the design that I want to do. And here I want to put tomatoes. And here I'm going to put, make sure I have plans for kale. And let's see, beside it, this is where I'm going to eventually put my garlic in. And then down at the bottom, let's see, something that I haven't planted yet, Swiss chard. So that's my, can't get my thing to write there. So that's my initial plan. So I definitely want to put tomatoes in that top section. So the tomatoes don't go in until, say, May. So if I'm thinking about, if I want to do intercropping or succession planting, what can I put in there before the tomatoes? So before the tomato, I'm going to put in lettuce. Doesn't want to write. That looks like lettuce, right? Sure, whatever. And so then I'll have my lettuce. I can intercrop it at some point because as the lettuce is finishing, I will put into my tomato. And then maybe I could do radishes.
Can you change your ink to either black or go to a blank screen?
I tried to do that, but it wouldn't. Let me see. Oh, there we go. Doesn't want to write. And then radish right there. Is that better?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. So just think about it in those terms. I'll give you about 10, 15 minutes to do that. Feel free to type in questions or unmute and ask questions. And, discuss amongst yourselves. You can do this as a group activity. The more the merrier. So hopefully that will get you thinking about doing these crop rotations. So the next year, look at year 2, and you're not going to put the tomatoes, lettuce, and radish in the same place. So where are you going to move it to the next year? let's take another minute or two and wrap up. Let me know if in the chat if you need more time than that. Otherwise, we will continue in about a minute or two.
So I'm anxious for the coordinators to maybe take a couple pictures of your Master Gardener's gardens, and you can share them with me, and then I can, or share them to John, and then I can share them, whichever. But it would be fun to see some of your Master Gardener gardens and how they did.
Yeah, that would be great if you could do that. So send them to either of us, or you can also tweet them. If you are on Twitter, do that. That would be great too. So let me get back to the screen.
I know some of my campus Master Gardeners were doing a great job.
Good. And I do apologize for my screen didn't switch over like it should have. So I was drawing on the wrong place. So
I thought you were drawing on paper and you were going to show it on your video.
No, I was actually drawing on the screen with my tablet pen. So, but apparently it didn't show up right. So we will know that next time. So if there are no other questions or comments, I will proceed with the section I call sort of best practices, or you know, thinking about growing vegetables in different ways. We've sort of talked about the planning process in the beginning. So now we're going to talk about some of the different things you can do, especially if you have maybe smaller space, or you want to maybe make gardening a little bit easier. So, you know, if we talk about making the most of your gardening space, doing what we would call like the intensive planting. So we have stuff like the raised bed gardening, where, you know, we can maybe make it a little easier to access, and also do the intensive planting. And one of those methods of intensive planting is square foot gardening. And so that's, we sort of experimented a little bit with that. And if we'll talk about that spacing a little bit more, but there are also the books out there that are available, or you can look up online resources, just, you know, Google it. Season extenders, I'll touch on those, but you'll be doing a whole class on those later, so we won't go too much into detail on that. And then I'll talk about that interplanting as well. So why raised beds? So aside from the things that I told you about earlier, one of the things we don't think about is that it's actually a season extension method. If you raise the soil up above the in-ground soil level, we actually have warmer air around it, and that soil warms up a little bit earlier in the season. So you can maybe get a few extra weeks of planting in there. We can use it where the native soil is too poor for gardening. So if you have bad soil, heavy soil, also if you have contaminated soil, you can use it in there. Using that dense planting, where we space things closer together and we don't have those rows spreading stuff apart, actually reduces weeds because it shades the soil. And also it creates easier access for mobility issues. So if you can raise that bed up, so you can do a raised bed, could be just a few inches above the ground, or you can go up to a foot or even feet. So I make mine about a foot tall. Just makes bending over a little bit easier. But if you have people with limited mobility, you can't bend, you're in a wheelchair, you can make them up as tall as you want. You just have to have a way to fill them up with soil. So that can get expensive. The recommended width for a raised bed is 4 feet, and that is because you can usually reach about 2 feet in and harvest and work in the garden. And you're creating this nice, soft, fluffy soil in the garden, and stepping on it compacts the soil. So you don't want to be stepping on the soil that you're creating. So that's why we recommend 4 feet. If it's someone that has a limited reach, or if you're building one for a child, it's 3 feet is the recommended width, and they can be as long as you want. So you can do a 4 by 4 foot square. One of the most common ones is 4 by 8, and you could go 4 by 12 or however long you want to go. They can be constructed from many different materials: landscape timbers, concrete blocks, landscape edging, and lumber. So a lot of people do sort of untreated lumber, which is okay. You just will have a limited lifespan out of that. And so you can do some sort of treatment like a linseed oil. You can use cedar. Cedar is more expensive, but the properties of cedar mean that it breaks down and sort of decomposes more slowly, so it will last a longer time. You can buy kits now that are made of like composite materials or plastic that last a long time. However, I get the question all the time, can I use treated lumber? And the question or the answer technically is yes, if it is new treated lumber. If it's before sometime in the 90s, they actually used arsenic in it, which it was not recommended to use it because of arsenic contamination, much like a lead contamination in the soil. But the newer ones use copper, which is much safer, and so you can use those. But if you're doing certified organic, you cannot. So they are technically safe to use if you want to use treated lumber. Just you want to make sure it's not the old recycled lumber. It has to be newer, that's made with copper, not arsenic. You also don't have to build a frame. It could just be mounded up soil. One of the most common methods, people that have maybe planted some of those squash or pumpkins or watermelon in the past, and you make a hill, you hill up soil and you sow the seeds in the hill. That's actually technically a raised bed to heat it up faster. So you could just do mounded soil. You want good soil and organic matter. However, there's sort of this misconception that with organic matter, there's no such thing as too much, and that is actually not true. You want to still have good soil in there, so don't just fill it with compost. Too much organic matter, you can get some sort of disease harboring stuff going on there. And if you are doing, you could introduce too much fertility, so you could have too many nutrients in it. Or if you're growing root crops like potatoes, excess organic matter actually can lead to things like the scabbing or to other diseases. So you want to avoid that. And in these beds, we plant stuff much closer together, so we make more intensive use of the space. So you can grow just as much in a smaller space than if you had a bigger garden with the traditional rows. So I just threw in some different designs that I've sort of scavenged from the internet over the years. Using those different materials, it can be as simple as a lumber frame, one of those kits. It can be edging material. It can be as simple or as fancy as you want. So build your garden to your heart's content. A lot of people, like I said, are going with those kits because they're so easy, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper every year. So use what works best for you. So you do have to think that it probably will need a little extra water in the summer months because it has such good drainage that it doesn't hold as much water. Good mulching, though, can reduce that water loss. Good sanitation. Since those plants are so close together, they can share diseases really easily. So if you see something with a disease, rather than leave it to contaminate everything else, pulling that out before it spreads that disease is good. Keeping everything clean, using mulch can help reduce spreading of diseases. And like I said, like when we talked about the railroad ties, we want to make sure we don't use materials that would leach anything into the soil that could be damaging or create issues. So one of the intensive spacing models is square foot gardening. So in the purest form, if you read the book, it will tell you to plant this crop in this square, and you can plant so many in this square, but no two squares can have an adjoining the same crop. So if I plant radishes in this square, then none of the squares that touch it can have radishes. And that's in that method to reduce disease spread. However, I practice a modified, maybe I do smaller multiple squares, because it's just too hard, I think, to plan for every square is different. It makes it really difficult. And then you can run into the issue where I've planted my radishes here and I didn't think about it, and the next square has kale, and after the kale grows, it really overruns the radishes and they stop growing or they die out. So I have to really think about that. So I do maybe larger, 4 square feet areas, or I will do like across, bands through the garden where, like when I did the 4 different areas, those, bigger areas, I think makes it a little easier. So it makes succession planting easier. Once the square is empty, you can just fill it in with something else. If we have lots of different plants in one area, we reduce that disease spread, because plant or diseases that affect tomatoes aren't necessarily going to affect lettuce. There are some that are cross-family, but a lot of them are family specific. And it does make crop rotation easy. So we see, some square foot garden layouts here, lots of different ways to do it, using string. The Square Foot Gardening organization, they have sort of a foundation. They actually sell these sticks that are sort of put together and they fold out accordion style, and you can lay that grid down in a 4x4 and plant stuff out. What I did, and I meant to put a picture in here, but I didn't. I actually went and bought a square foot vinyl floor tile and did the layout on there. So I drilled holes in, and I can drop the seeds in that area, and I use multiple tiles, and I can lay out the whole area and make it a little bit easier. So you can find whatever works for you. But if you're interested in that, I would pick up the book or look up those online resources. And you can think about, that spacing. So you look on the packet, or you look up the information, and, you take that spacing. So if it says plant, space 3 inches apart in rows, so you're keeping that 3 inches spacing, but you're eliminating the row. So instead of, 3 inches apart in the row and then, 1.5 feet between rows, it's 3 inches between plants in all directions. So we can end up with things like 1 or more per square foot. Cole crops, tomatoes, like I said, you could get by with 1 in a square foot if they're not side by side. You would need like an area around it. But a lot of tomatoes need at least 2, if not 4 squares around it for best growth. 4 per square foot, large greens, chard. 9 per square foot, we go up to things like beans and peas, beets, turnips, and you can go up to 16 per square foot in things like carrots and radishes. So it can help you with that layout a little bit. Interplanting, so we take advantage of different growing times and areas. So we can plant fast-growing plants around slower-growing plants. So let's say I plant my tomatoes, and it'll take a while for my tomatoes to get up to a decent size. So I could maybe sow a few radishes around it and grow radishes that grow very quickly. Or I could have my lettuce in the spring, thin it out, and then plant my tomato. And then after the tomato grows up to a certain size, pull that lettuce out. So we want to use different growth habits to save space. Plant warm season crops between the cool season crops. The most classic example would be the Three Sisters, which is a Native American technique where you plant corn. The corn comes up, maybe it's a foot or two tall. Then you plant beans. The beans run up the corn. So the beans get to use it as a, the trellis. The beans provide nitrogen into the soil. And then the squash will be planted after the beans are grown, and it will provide weed protection by growing on the ground and shading the ground. This we call interplanting, is sort of one of the things that people have morphed into what we call companion planting. In companion planting, a lot of those things are things that we would consider in that misinformation that you might find. So a lot of that information is kind of dubious, but we do promote interplanting when we talk about gardening and master gardeners. So here's some of those examples. The Three Sisters, using that space. Here we've got maybe some broccoli growing, and the broccoli will be slow growing, so we've grown some fast growing lettuce around it. Or down at the bottom, we have a high tunnel there, and we've got rows of tomatoes in the high tunnel. And to use the space on either side, we've actually put some fast-growing greens, some lettuce and things in there that will grow quickly, and then we'll take them out. So just think about using the space in multiple ways whenever you're interplanting. So a lot of people ask about organic gardening. Organic gardening is a practice that uses all organic inputs. And so everything is approved for organic use. So it combines effective integrated pest management, where we're sort of avoiding problems before they happen. We use organic pest control and organic fertility. So there's, like I've touched on before, there's this sort of myth that organic means no pesticide usage, and that isn't true. There are lots of pesticides that are approved for organic use. And I sort of, have seen these gardens where people say, I don't spray anything, and they have diseases that are killing everything, or everything has spots on it. And I sort of call that organic by neglect. They don't really have the best production. They don't have good quality produce. And so maybe using some of those organically approved controls can help out. And then with organic fertility, you're going to use the organic matter like composts as fertilizer. You can also buy organic fertilizers, commercially, that are prepared. They're usually made with things like bone meal and manures, like dried manures and things. And a lot of people do it because of safety concerns, though most studies show that if it's produced in a non-organic way, in the appropriate way, if you're using a pesticide, and you're using a conventional pesticide and you use it properly by the label, there's not really any more risk to that than organic production. And also, since we are using pesticides on organic produce, and especially if you're buying it at the store, it does have pesticide on it, then that is not necessarily safer in the long run. So how do we do soil fertility when we're organic? So we definitely want to do that soil testing. We want to know what we need. We use the organic sources like composts, manures, and we can use cover crops to add fertility, and they also can help reduce diseases and insect problems. So composts, if you're making compost at home, you're using yard waste or crop residues from those. So if we look at this chart, we actually see, if you go buy a bag of fertilizer, it is 10, 10, 10, or 5, 3, 6, or whatever it is. So that's a percentage. So if we look here, we can see, and this is dry weight. So if you're using compost, it's going to be wet. So these numbers are actually much lower. So your home compost, if it was completely dried out, would only have 1% nitrogen in there. So home compost does have some fertility in it, but it is not what I would say high fertility. If you're using manures, you need to use composted manures that have been aged. They do have higher fertility, and poultry manure is typically high fertility, especially with nitrogen. So you can use those, but there are some issues that you want to consider, especially when using manures, and that is with food safety. So those, especially manures, can introduce human pathogens like E. coli and Salmonella to the soil that could then be transferred to the crops. So this is a big issue in the farming world when producers are growing crops for human consumption. And so you could also think about it in the home garden. It's especially important if the crops are eaten raw. So if you're cooking it, there's less of a risk because cooking will kill those. Or if it is in contact with the soil, like it's a root crop or one of those leafy greens that are grown right in contact with the soil. So we do recommend a post manure or compost, especially manure, even if it's aged or composted, a post-application waiting period before you harvest. So it's 120 days at least for crops that are in contact with the soil. And it's 90 days for crops that are not in contact with the soil. So if I am applying manure, I want to maybe do it in the fall. So then when I plant next spring, then I will have gone through that waiting period. If I apply in the spring, I have to do it and make sure that the crop that I will be harvesting will mature after this waiting period. So you can plant it, especially those that aren't in contact with the soil, but the harvesting has to occur after the 90 or 120-day window. So with pest control, we heavily rely on integrated pest management, where we're doing things like selecting plants that are disease resistant, using barriers like row cover to keep insects off, things like that. There are some chemicals that are listed as organic, and you can find that listing. There's what's called the OMRI list that has those on there. Some common ones that I can think of right off the top of my head for insect control, there's pyrethrum, which is from a chrysanthemum type flower. And if you're trying to, say, prevent a fungal issue, like if you always get tomato blight or leaf spot, there's something called Serenade, which is actually, it comes from a bacteria, and you spray it on and it sort of competes with that bacteria or competes with the disease organisms. I will say that, it's sort of like a fermentation product from these bacteria, so it doesn't smell the best. And also you can attract or release beneficial insects. So attracting them with diverse plantings, with flowers, things will increase the insect life, because if you have lots of insects, more or less you're going to be attracting things that will eat or outcompete the bad insects. Or you can, if you have large populations and can sustain them, you can purchase the beneficial insects like lacewings or lady beetles. Though the effectiveness of those are questionable, because a lot of times they don't really hang around, especially if there's not a lot to eat. So mulching, that was the question. So we are reducing weeds and reducing water loss. So my go-to are straw and newspaper. Those are the ones I think are the easiest because they typically break down within the season, or can be incorporated into the soil at the end of the season and will break down. And I think they're a little more temporary. However, you can use wood chip mulch if you want to. However, with the caveat that, number one, that's usually a little more expensive if you don't have easy access to them. Also, there's a question of, well, does that tie up the nitrogen in the system? There is an issue. So any of these materials that you put down are high in carbon, and so they're basically going to begin the decomposition process immediately, where the bacteria and the fungus in the soil is going to try to break them down. And to do that, they need nitrogen. It doesn't really happen at that soil interface. So if you have the mulch on the top layer of the soil, then the issue isn't, there isn't as big of an issue with that. But if you incorporate them into the soil and they're there for a long time, that will tie up the nitrogen as it decomposes. So that's why I like straw and newspaper a little bit better, because they break down much quicker than that. If you use wood chips, though, and you get them incorporated into the soil, you can have that nitrogen tie up. And so since wood chips last a whole lot longer, I think it's a little harder to control that. So here, just some examples, using that straw. I think, I love straw, or I do newspaper. I shred it up. Good project for kids if you have a paper shredder and run the newspaper through. Or you can see on the right side there, there are, I think, some wood chips and leaves mixed together as a mulch between those sort of little, so it's sort of a bed, and then there's rows in the bed, and they're using that between those rows of different things there.
You have a couple mulch questions in the chat box.
I saw some blinking there. Concern about chemical residue on the straw. There is an issue if, knowing if there was some sort of pesticide used on it. And that can be a hard one. So typically, I would say in most cases, it's okay to use if you're concerned about it, or if you have an issue, you might want to sort of test it out, like use it in a small area and see. But there has been an issue when there were some herbicides used on fields that were persistent. One of the herbicides that was used on that was actually taken off the market because it never broke down. So there was an issue a few years ago with that, but it has been reduced. But there still is that possibility, so you have to be on the lookout for that. Grass clippings will work. My issue with grass clippings is that they will compact down pretty easily, and so that can create a barrier where water or air won't move through. And also, usually if you have them piled up, they start the anaerobic decomposition, and they don't smell as well. And also with grass, if you have weeds in the grass, you have weed seeds in the grass clippings. Or if you have a treated lawn, then you could have herbicide that has killed those in the grass. So you have to think about those issues. And yes, leaves only. Leave them whole. One of the things, if you sort of put them through a leaf vacuum or chop them up, is that they compact down easier. So using whole leaves if you can, especially in the fall, that's good to cover the soil instead of leaving it bare. That's good. So
you have a question about sawdust too.
Let me see.
About using sawdust.
Sawdust, it is usable, but it still has that same caveat that I said with the chopping of the leaves or the grass, where the smaller the particles, the easier it is to sort of compact down. So you have to think about that whenever you're selecting a mulch.
And then before you move on to cover crops, one question that came through Slido was, is the composted cattle manure from a feedlot that uses growth hormone implants safe since it's composted?
That is a good question. I would think the composting process usually breaks down a lot of anything that is in there. So typically, yes, and I think thinking about production, I don't think I think the use of the growth hormone may be overreported. I don't think it's as common as people think. But breaking, the composting process would break down stuff like that. So we're going into cover crops, and we'll cover the next question that just popped up. So cover crops are a great way to assist with fertility because we're growing something that will add soil or add fertility into the soil. Also, it can help control soil erosion. Why are we not processing here? So it gives us biomass, so that organic material back in, adds nutrients, helps with microbes, reduces weeds. There's all kinds of good things that cover crops can do, including habitat for beneficial insects. And so they're used a lot now in agricultural production, but they aren't used as much in home gardens because we think about, how do we incorporate those? So in a lot of cases, they're used in systems where there might be tillage. And so that's something that, home gardeners, we are encouraging reducing, or if you have raised beds, you're not necessarily tilling those. So how do we use them? So you could do a fall or winter cover crop, like a winter wheat or something like that, leave it in over the winter, and then you can maybe cut it down and take the residue and compost it and leave what you cut there if you want, and then introduce the compost back into the bed at a later date by top dressing that, or think about stuff that maybe winter kill, like if you're planting something that's more of a warm season plant, you plant it in the fall, then it will die over winter. It will still be there, in its dried out dead form to protect the soil. And then you can either remove it or just, let it act as sort of like a mulch in place in the next season. So there are a few negatives. So, having that plant cover will keep the sun off of the soil, so it could cool the soil. You have to select the right one. Some are hard to kill. I've had people ask, well, what about, there are clovers that you can use, like crimson clover, which is a good one. But, some people, well, what about white clover? And white clover is actually a perennial and it will persist. So if you're okay with that, that's fine. But, you would have to figure out a way to kill it off. If you till it in, it can tie up nitrogen for a few weeks because it's decomposing that, and then it will release it. And if you maybe are slow to get into your gardening in the spring, those that have overwintered, maybe it will grow a little too fast if you wait too long, and it could be hard to manage if you let it go too large. So season extension, I'm just going to touch on. So it can be used for early planting. So if I'm planting early before the frost and freeze is over, I can add protection, or I can get stuff late through the season. Some techniques, like if I'm using a floating row cover, could keep insects off of crops. Say, broccoli and cabbage and cauliflower, they don't need an insect pollinator. So if you put row cover on them when you plant them, and it's big, it's big enough to grow with the plant, then you can keep the moth or the butterfly from laying the eggs for the cabbage loopers and cabbage worms on there. So you can reduce insect pests. And there are a variety of different options. So I just threw some pictures of some of them on here. We've got floating row covers, using a row cover in a tunnel with like hoops. We have plastic low tunnels, high tunnels, cold frames, cloches, all those different things on there. I got a question back for cover crops. So what about a summer cover crop? So you can use one of the clovers there. You can use buckwheat. Buckwheat is a good crop. for that. It's fast growing and will spread and kill out weeds. However, you have to be wary if you are a beekeeper or have beekeepers nearby. The buckwheat nectar actually produces a very dark honey that's almost like a molasses. So it really changes the character of that. So you would have to think about something like that. And so if we have a small space, we don't often think about vertical gardening as a way to grow more. So we want to grow up instead of out. And so if we have a small space and we're using a raised bed or have containers, we've sort of been conditioned that there are these crops that say they're space savers and they're like bush type. So there's like a Space Master cucumber that is a bushing type. Well, it might be smaller for, say, a traditional in-ground row garden, but for a raised bed garden, that is actually taking up a lot of space vertically. So if I had a vining cucumber that I ran up a trellis, I could actually get a whole lot more in that space because I'm only using maybe one square out of the square foot instead of like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares. So think about, usually vining and running them up a trellis is better than the bush type if you have a small space. And you can use that small space or the space underneath for interplanting. So if I do beans, pole beans, and I run them up and I do like a teepee out of the beans, then I can maybe sow some lettuce or radishes or something at the base, and they will actually provide shade that will then keep those from bolting when it gets a little bit warmer. So we can make good use of space, or we can go really creative. So we can be really vertical and do something like this hydroponic production. People think that this is gutter, and this is not. This is actually in greenhouse production. They use these channels that's like a nutrient film. And so this is that just used vertically instead of horizontally in the garden. So, growing up, making a green wall or something, that's the really creative. I had a question pop up about biochar and compost. Are they beneficial? And the answer to both of those is yes. Compost is really beneficial, been used for many, many years and proven effective. And there is research that shows that using biochar also is a good soil amendment as well. So some other vertical growing here, thinking about, even in small spaces, this is a little trellis, that they have maybe not some really big pole beans. Maybe it's a short pole bean or a cucumber or something that'll grow on that trellis. And then we see the lettuce underneath that will get some shade, and that shade will help keep it from bolting whenever it gets too warm. So we can be a little creative in using our space wisely. So I'm just going to end here a few minutes with some plant selection, going back there. So many of you may know that we have the All-America Selections demonstration garden on campus, the Backyard Farmer Garden. Last year we actually added trials. So these are newer varieties that are hitting the market that have been tested. And so I'm doing the trial here or in Omaha at the farm that we work with. So they're being tested out in our area. And so I was just going to end by sharing the new winners for this year. So if we progress through here. So here's, where we grew them last year. We have actually a 100-acre farm in Omaha that we use with Omaha Home for Boys. So we grew lots of tomatoes and peppers last year and tested them out. And there's the Backyard Farmer Garden where after they win, then they are on display. And so you can go check out the winners this year in the Backyard Farmer Garden. So my favorite one was actually the pak choi. So it was actually very slow to bolt. And so I planted it in May and actually was still harvesting in October. And the ones that they sent to compare it to had bolted very shortly after planting. There was a cayenne pepper that won. The people liked them in our taste test. So that one is Red Ember is a new one that's a winner. Went a little too fast. So habanero roulette. So I actually didn't do a taste test on these because they didn't tell me that they were not hot. These are a heatless habanero. So they have that habanero citrusy sweet flavor, but they are not hot. They're maybe slightly warm, but no heat, no habanero heat on those. A cocktail tomato, so it's bigger than a grape or cherry, but smaller than a slicer. And this one is Red Racer, had large yields, and it's an earlier tomato than most other varieties. And Valentine, which was a grape tomato, small little tomato. Sorry about that. And then there was sweet corn, which we actually didn't test in our garden, but it was a winner there, and that is American Dream. And I had one question that we will get to in the question and answer phase, which I think begins now. Right, Terry?
Yes.
Okie dokie. So the question was, explain biochar. So biochar is where maybe there has been some sort of organic waste. So the one system that I've seen is taking poultry litter and using this slow heating process. It's not burning it, but it's basically turning it into almost like a charcoal type product. So it still has plant nutrients. It helps with like nutrient holding capacity. It helps introduce some texture. And so basically it's a side product from some of those industries like poultry, or where there might be some manure. It makes it maybe more transportable and easier to use for some people. So it's not that common. And you can find it here and there, but it is sort of one of those emerging soil amendments. Will these All America Selection winners be available in stores to homeowners? Yes, so they are available this year. They're available now. So what I would suggest is you can go to the All America Selections website, and they will tell you where to get them. Like I know at least one of the tomatoes, maybe two of them, were from Johnny's Seeds. So basically, in the first year that they're available, they're usually only available from whatever company or breeder introduced them. So Johnny's introduced one of those tomatoes, so it's only available at Johnny's. In future years, they may make it available to other companies, and you'll see it other places. But you need to find that list. So I know at least one of those tomatoes was from Johnny's. But you can just look up the All America Selections and look for that logo, the AAS winner logo. And there are lots of different companies have All America Selection winners. Another question, is it okay to plant fruits like strawberries or other berries within a vegetable garden? How would you rotate? So the issue there is that a lot of those are perennials, or we grow them as perennials. So it becomes harder to put them in a rotation because they're going to be there for multiple years. You could still do it. Now with strawberries, if you're a strawberry producer or a strawberry farmer, you grow strawberries as an annual. So if you're growing them as an annual, then there's not an issue there. But most people for home gardeners grow them for multiple years in a rotation. So you could maybe have a bed that you have those fruits in, and then maybe you plan to rotate them out after a few years and use that for vegetables. So you could incorporate it that way.
So Carol Larvik runs the orchard up in Sioux City, and she says that they use biochar, and a lot of the biochar here is actually from switchgrass.
Okay.
So they've been working on switchgrass for energy and or a fuel, alternative fuel, and then they've used the biochar from that.
Right. Yeah. So that would be like a byproduct of that process. We don't have as much of that, growing grass thing from where I'm from back in West Virginia. But we did have a poultry industry, and they were using that. And so that may, and it really, the process sort of like you can't really, it turns it into a product that's pretty uniform. So, you wouldn't, technically maybe know unless you bought it directly from the source what it was made out of.
So I don't know if you told them that we will have all those 2018 vegetables here on campus.
Yes, they are at the backyard farmer garden. So they will be, you can go look at them, check them out. If you don't want to grow them this year, if you want to grow them this year, just look up All America Selections, and they will basically, they'll say, it was from this catalog or from this company, and then you just need to go to that company and find it. But then after this year, they usually may spread out to other catalogs.
And then I have a question from Slido. It's, in your opinion, when preparing a no-till garden, which carbon layer is and cover crop is best?
Like I said, my favorite is either straw or shredded newspaper, just because it's easier to use, I think. So that's just my preference. It depends on what you have available easy or what you prefer to work with. Cover crops, usually one of the ryes, like the winter rye or the annual rye that would winter kill. People use those in the fall, so that's probably the most commonly used. The crimson clover is good. For summer, it would be buckwheat or something like that.
How could you incorporate wood ash in your garden?
So that's a question we get. So you would only want to even think about incorporating that if you needed. It's really high in potassium. You could have some heavy metals in it though, so you want to watch out for that. And it's actually going to raise the pH because it's high in calcium as well. So that's an issue that you might not want to do that. Really, it's touchy about doing that, just because it's so hard. You don't know exactly what's in it because it's not been tested. So that could potentially create an issue there.
Okay. Do you guys have any more questions for John?
So I put up ways to contact me through social media, online, email. That's my office phone. So usually you can leave a message there and I'll get back to you. Because as Terry says, I'm everywhere. I'm never home, which is a lie. But usually that actually, I have it set, it goes into my email. So it's a little easier for me to do messages through the phone if I can call you back.
So I have the last poll up. So if you guys could answer that, I would really appreciate it. I want to thank you, John, for taking your time out of your busy schedule to talk to us about veggies. Remember, next week is the critters, so they'll be the things that are eating our veggies. And if you could, coordinators, get some of those pictures of those gardens sent to us, that we'd really appreciate it. That'd be fun to see.
Yes.
So thank you, John. And I will see you guys all next week.
Thank you. Enjoy your gardening.
That was a good radio voice.